A recent report from the Joint Committee on Human Rights has exposed the dangers to Christians from the government's approach to countering extremism. I've got Ciarán Kelly on the phone, who's the head of communications at the Christian Institute, to find out more. Hi, Ciarán.
Hi, Heather.
So, first of all, what is the Joint Committee on Human Rights?
So the word joint is important. This is a committee which comprises of MPs from the House of Commons and peers from the House of Lords. There's a number of these on various aspects of government life and work. And this one in particular is focused on human rights.
So the committee was tasked with examining the government's planned counter-extremism legislation. What are the government's plans in that legislation?
Well, that is a very good question and quite difficult to answer. And the reason it's difficult to answer is because the plans are far from clear. Let's think about some of the context in this. The government, this was introduced quite some time ago, and David Cameron introduced it with the suggestion, when he was Prime Minister, with the suggestion that it was about time that we stopped saying that obeying the law was enough. We need to turn the page on that approach. It's a failed approach, and we need to deal with these people who might be keeping the law, but we don't like what they're doing. And ever since then, the government has been questioned on who exactly it is that they have in mind, and they haven't been very forthcoming in terms of what they are actually trying to achieve. Now, clearly, what they're trying to do here is to take some action against extremists who can be a threat to society, who are violent extremists. That's what you would think anyway, but the conversation keeps being about non-violent extremists and people who incite hatred or are not taking violent acts themselves, but are somehow catering for an extremist mindset. Now, everybody agrees with the need to tackle violent extremists. I don't think there is going to be much in the way of debate over that. The problem comes when you start trying to talk about what non-violent extremism is. And the legislation that the government is talking about smacks very much of something must be done, and therefore we're going to come up with something. What they've come up with is a catch-all set of criteria that pretty much boils down to, if we don't like it, then we can classify it as extremist, and we can take action against you. And what the legislation talks about is introducing some civil orders, and there's some orders called extremism disruption orders, and some banning orders as well. And how these will be applied is they'd have a very low threshold of application. But if someone deems something that you or I might say or write as extremist in some fashion, an application can be made for one of these disruption orders that would stop you from meeting with various people or stop you posting on social media. So if I'm being vague about it, that is because the legislation as it has been talked about thus far is extremely vague, and that's the problem. Pretty much anybody who says something which is perhaps non-mainstream could be caught up under the term extremism.
So why was this committee tasked with examining the legislation?
Well, I mean, it's reasonably normal for committees to examine legislation. It happens all the time. But this particular piece of legislation is a real cause for concern. It's a cause for concern for many, many people. Harriet Harman chairs that committee, and she was extremely critical of it. What the committee was responding to was various pieces of evidence around concerns over the legislation. What was the government trying to achieve? Who was the government targeting? What constitutes the term extremism? What does that mean? What does that look like? What's the offence which doesn't already exist that you're seeking to legislate for? And this committee was scathing about the government's approach to it. They said that they'd failed to demonstrate why the new law was needed. They said there was nothing from what the government was saying to suggest they had anything resembling coherent or precise definition of non-violent extremism or British values which were associated to it. It was gauged far too widely. Free speech was under threat. It was likely to interfere with any number of human rights. It just goes on and on. So it's very normal for committees to review legislation. The strength by which with which they criticise this legislation is rather more unusual.
They also referred to the government's assumption that there's an escalator that starts with religious conservatism and ends with support for jihadism.
Right.
So what was it they said about that?
Well, they said it was a false notion. So they attacking the idea that if you have, let's say, are strong in your views that marriage is between a man and a woman, then that might be characteristic of you being on this escalator that ends up with jihad. Now that's likely to be offensive to many millions of people in the UK, never mind further afield. And this is at the heart of the problem with this legislation, that rather than looking at the actions which are of people that are terrorist actions, which are covered by any number of existing laws, this is a thought crime law that suggests that if you hold particular views which perhaps aren't mainstream or are less socially acceptable, if you like, less politically correct than perhaps they once were, then that's probably an indication that you're somewhere on this escalator towards undertaking jihad.
And what about their plans to inspect church youth work? What were their thoughts on that?
Yes, well, they were certainly quite critical of that as well. They talked about having very grave concerns about that. This is the idea that out-of-school settings, as they're called, which would include church youth work, that those settings would have to register in order to operate, and then having registered would be susceptible to Ofsted coming in and expecting them for their compliance to British values. And they said that they didn't support a regime of routine inspections of those kinds of settings. They talked about the fact that that would catch groups, not just church groups, but all sorts of groups indiscriminately. And they said that whether it's evangelical Christians or it's Orthodox Jews or it's just others with conservative religious views who don't encourage violence in any way, through the EDOs and through the out-of-school settings, they could all be penalised.
Are the government obliged to take on board what's said in the report?
They are likely to take on board. There isn't kind of a definite obligation for them to actually take on board the concerns in practice. I mean, what they have said is that they will carefully consider them and that they respond in due course. It does seem unthinkable that they wouldn't pay them very high regard, though.
The government originally announced the Counter-extremism bill in May 2015, but it hasn't appeared yet. Why is that?
Well, I think the primary reason for that is because it lacks a clear definition of what extremism is. And without that definition is going to have to be central to that legislation. They've said that they are going to hold a consultation. They're looking for input to that. It'd be almost impossible to give some serious responses to a consultation that isn't clear on what it's actually trying to achieve.
So what would you expect to happen next?
Well, I can tell you what I hope to happen next is I think that I would hope that the government would recognise that they just haven't thought this through at all. I think that they should sit down, look at the existing legislation that is in place and really ask themselves a serious question of, actually, is there any kind of gap here for us to deal with? I think the answer to that is no. And if they conclude that the answer is no, then this legislation is over before it started.